Hello, my name is Laith. I was in the EU5 announcement trailer, and I'm here today to teach you about trade. I'm going to be dividing this tutorial up into several different sections, so if there's a particular part of trade you're looking for, then you can use the handy timestamps on the timeline to navigate. I'm going to be taking you through all things from how to make money from trade, how markets work, into more of the nitty-gritty like trade capacity and trade advantage. At the end, I'll give you two nations that I think you should try to get to grips with trade in Europa Universalis 5. In order to discuss anything to do with trade, first we need to discuss markets, what they are, what they do, how they work, and all of that good stuff. This is what markets look like in the 1st of April 1337, at the start of EU5. In this game, we are playing as Hungary, and so Pest is our main market. You can see here, we can navigate up to this screen, and we can see the different markets that we have a presence in. Some of our locations belong to this market in Krakow, some of them belong to Venice, but the majority are in Pest, and we are the market controller of Pest. What does that mean? I will get to that, don't you worry. Just hovering over any market, we can see the total value over here, we can see the greatest surplus, greatest needs, as well as things like the trade advantage, trade capacity. For Pest, it's only us, we're a bit lonely. Over here in Venice, it's a little bit more complicated. So first things first, why are some of these locations in the Pest market and some of them are in the Venice one? So first things first, why are some of these locations that I own in the Pest market and some in the Venice market? So a way that this market works is that all of these different locations that exist within the market are going to buy and sell their goods here. For example, over here in this, I should have picked an easier province to pronounce, Pest! Over here in Pest, we have some wheat as an RGO, that's going to be sold. We also have buildings. So for example, over here, this building uses copper and also tin to produce tools, so it's going to purchase that copper and tin on this market. It's also then going to sell the tools on that market. So what determines if a location is in one market or not? Like I said, over here, these guys are in Venice, even though they are mine. So this wheat gets sold on the Venetian market, not my market. We can hover over here and see why. You can see that the highest market traction, just about barely, is Venice versus Pest. So what determines our market's attraction? Well, let's start top down. Firstly, we have Hungary's impact. So that's our national impact on all of our markets. That is coming in now from prestige and trade income versus our tax base. That is going to extend to all of our markets. Looking at Pest directly, it's further helped along by the development in Pest as well as the staff buildings in the location. And compare this 3.62% to Venice's almost 10%. And you'll find quickly that places like Zagreb, which should come to my market, will instead flip to Venice. And then coming down to an individual location basis, generally speaking, it's also going to be impacted by how easily they can get to the market capital. You can see the route that they're going to take. So for example, if I were to build infrastructure all the way down here to Zagreb, I was to facilitate that through roads, then Zagreb is likely to flip to me. There is another thing to consider here, which is market protection. Over here, we have 0% market protection, but this is essentially going to impact how likely a location is to leave our market and go to someone else's. Obviously, it's not going to come into play if we're flipping between two markets that we own ourselves. Now, looking at the market as a whole, we can see the price of these things. So each good has a base price, which is then modified. For example, stone has a base price of 1, and then because of how much supply versus demand, its price has dropped by almost 90%. At current, the range is from minus 90% to 500%. That is how much the base price can be changed by. This doesn't happen instantly. You can see there's a monthly change slowly ticking towards this target price here. On the flip side, you can see that things like fur and fine cloth, their price is trending upwards. We're going to see a target price of 18 reached here at some point. So the buildings in the Pest market will purchase goods at the price on the market. For example, if you have a weavery or something that produces cloth, then you're going to use potentially wool as an input. So the cheaper the wool that you have in your market, the more profitable that building. Equally, if the price of wool skyrockets, maybe that is no longer profitable. And that's something you can force in other markets, but we'll get into economic warfare in a little bit. The main question you might be asking yourself is, how do I make money here? Well, the game does suggest certain trades here for profit. If you go over here and automate trade, then the game will select the most profitable trade for you. It's not going to be as good as a human. Let's get that out of the way. Equally, if you need specific goods, let's say you want to, in the aforementioned example, drop the price of wool, maybe you're trying to import wool in for cheap. So even if it doesn't make the most economic sense in a purely trading perspective, it makes more sense in terms of your supply chains. But that's a little bit complicated, so let's look at just making money off of some trades. So over here, I can export some dyes from Pest to Prague. We make our money on the difference between these things. So the current price of dyes in Prague is 4. The current price over here in Pest is 1. So let's go ahead and facilitate that trade. All right, we've ticked over a month and we can see here that we are trading 3 dye and we're making a really quite a nice profit of 8.31. Various things can affect how much money you make here. The goods we purchase on the Pest market, you can see that over here. 3 of them have been purchased for this price. Then it's going to be exported to the Prague market where it is sold at the Prague price. Then we have the other factors. So the maintenance cost. You can see here the base cost is 0.05 ducats per unit of trade capacity used. And then we have other expenses potentially like sound tolls. So generally speaking, the more efficient and close a market is, the less expensive it's going to be. If I'm exporting my dyes to, let's say, South Africa, that is going to be a lot more expensive. On top of that, some locations have things like sound tolls. For example, if I'm going to import goods through here, I'm probably going to get charged a sound toll by the Danes. This is historically how a lot of people made a lot of money. Simply put down a castle overlooking the sea. Hey presto, only let people in that give you money. So that is very simply how to make money off of trade, but that isn't the actual money I'm going to be making here. You can see that I only make 1.72. Why is that? Well, when a trade is profitable, the profits are split amongst the estates, the various interested parties in your nation. So over here, we have 20% crown power, and so we are going to get 20% of that trade. The higher your crown power, the more money you make off of these trades. So how do I trade more? I don't actually have any trade capacity left in my market. Trade capacity is the resource that you use to facilitate trades. In this case, I have 2.1 trade capacity, and so I can use 2.1 trade capacity to push trade. That's either importing or exporting from a market. If I were to import from Prague, then I would use my trade capacity. If I'm to export from Pest to Prague, I'm going to use my trade capacity. Now, it's important to note that this trade capacity is split between markets. This is where things are going to get a little bit more complicated. I don't have any trade capacity in the Venice market, which means that I can't export goods that are produced and sold from Venice, nor can I import them to Venice. That doesn't mean I can't import from Venice into Pest, because I'd be using my Pest trade capacity. That's kind of the tricky part that took me a long time to realize, I'm not gonna lie, an embarrassing long amount of time. So let's say I wanted to get more trade capacity in Venice, then I would make sure to build marketplaces over here in Zagreb. Handily, if I'm gonna search buildings, I can do things like trade capacity, and it'll tell you different buildings that produce trade capacity. Some of them we can build, some of them can't, some of them come in a little bit later on, some of them are locked off to us. So the main one we're going to be focusing on, and one that you should get at the start of the game, is this, a marketplace. Each marketplace is going to, provided you have the full employment, give you 1 trade advantage and 1 trade capacity. It's also going to increase the burgers' trade capacity, because they're going to be trading at the same time. That's kind of their whole thing, of course. So let's go ahead and build a couple of these in different locations. And so at this point, I'd like to point out that the cost of actually getting these buildings is impacted by the price of the goods. So if I flood my market with really cheap lumber and masonry, it's going to make construction a lot cheaper in my markets where I'm building those things. Okay, so most of our marketplaces are done. If we have a look over here now, we have a lot more trade capacity over in Pest and some over in Venice. Also, you can automate individual markets here, so you don't have to focus on tiny markets. So for example, Venice does not represent that big of an economic deal for me, so I might just automate that and focus on Pest. But let's have a look at our current trades. You can see here that I'm actually importing legumes from Nuremberg to Venice. Even though I'm not the market controller, even though I'm not a big player in Venice, I can still facilitate those trades. I can adjust the amount of trade capacity I'm using over here in each one, and then I can click this to create a new trade. So you can see now our trade income has doubled because of all of those marketplaces. And that's not the only benefit of this. Obviously, if I am selling produced goods to other markets, my people are employed making me money and giving me tax. I can also tax the estates. So it's not just the singular way I make money. This is a very systemic game and it's very intertwined. But let's talk about this thing here, trade advantage. Let's say there are only 5 horses on the Venice market. I want 5 horses, so I put in my order for 5 horses. Venice also wants 5 horses, but because of their trade advantage, they get their needs fulfilled first. Let's say I have a reliable import of amber, so I'm importing from Kiev and it's going to Pest. I'm going to be using that amber in my Jewelers Guild to produce jewelry. Suddenly, Georgia, who have for some reason become a trading republic, have a much higher trade advantage than I do over here in the Kiev market, and they order all of the amber. Suddenly my industry is starting to collapse. So you might start to understand how you might do a little bit of economic warfare. So what are the different ways that you can improve your trade advantage? Well, it's back to the handy search bar over here. You can see that marketplaces give us trade advantages. There's obviously trading posts, trade office, market warehouses, even market villages, which can be built in rural locations, will also give you trade advantage. So why don't I give you a little example over here? I've tagged into Venice and they're immediately at war. Okay, good stuff, Venice. Over here in Venice, we have some tools guild, and we're using iron for that. So hypothetically, let's say Barcelona, for whatever reason, was a fantastic source of iron. What I would want to do is make sure that I have as much trade advantage over there as possible so that I could be the first person to buy all the cheap iron to import it into my Venice market to mean that my produced goods are now way more profitable. I can also do that to such an extent that I can starve nations of their own resources. Remember, these RGOs are producing goods and selling them on the market, but if I have the highest trade advantage in places like Paris, Bordeaux, and Barcelona, I can stop the French from producing, let's say, fine cloth by buying all of their raw resources before they can make use of it. This will make you really unpopular in multiplayer. So you can see that Venice, a trade-focused nation, is present in a lot of different markets and so can facilitate more trades. The final thing to note here is trade range. So that determines which markets I can and cannot trade with. Everything you see here that's colored, I can actually trade with because I have enough trade range. London, unfortunately, is a little bit too far away. As Austria, for example, I'm rather nastily sandwiched between a lot of different markets whose market capitals I'm far from. You see Vienna, my capital, belongs to the Nuremberg market, which is really quite far away. So, which means any buildings in Vienna are going to have a lower purchasing priority than a building in Nuremberg, for example. So that might be a good idea to create your own market. And you'll see the AI do this quite often. So let's say I'm going to go now and create my own market. How do I do that? Well, I navigate over here and there's a big old button saying create market. I'm going to click this and then all of the options pop up. And the price of it is determined as to how close you are to the market capital that you're currently in. Essentially, if you have lower market access because you're really far away, it's going to be a lot cheaper. It's easy to see over here where this only costs 98 because of how far away it is from Pest, whereas this one over here is going to cost us 318. Another thing to note when it comes to your buildings is the possible production methods. The game by default, if you have it automated, will select the best one for you. But this is where you can get a bit proactive in how you play the trade game in EU5. If you know that you can secure a really cheap source of stone or perhaps really cheap copper and tin, that is going to make your tools a lot more profitable in this case, and you can price out your competition. With spinner guilds, for example, in England, wool is an incredibly abundant resource. Later on, though, for example, we know that over in the New World, cotton might be a very, very valuable replacement. So if I rush to the New World, I build up a massive source of cotton, I import it into my London market from another one of my markets, then I can produce cloth a lot cheaper than everyone else in Europe, and thus I can start to price them out. Equally, what I could also do at the start of the game is start exporting wool to different markets to make wool a lot cheaper and make them dependent on English wool. More than any other game, I feel like you can start to mess with your opponents economically, which is really, really cool. That is a very, very, very brief and basic overview of the trade system and how you can take advantage of it in Europa Universalis 5. Using these concepts, you can extrapolate further and start to do things like the triangle trade, for example, securing slaves in West Africa, cash crops over in the New World, and export them to a hungry populace over in England. If you're going to remember anything from this tutorial, it's that the most profitable thing might not be the best thing long term, because everything has a knock-on effect. So when you start to understand it and fully engage with it, this becomes a lot of fun. My advice for new players: turn on automation for these smaller markets. You don't need to mess with them. Start to get to grips with one market. Build a ton of marketplaces. A nation like Hungary is really, really good to start with. That's my recommendation, to start playing around with markets, because you dominate your own market. No one else is in there, and you can monitor the ins and outs. Later on, if you want to get a little bit more fancy and start to do some economic warfare, I would highly recommend Venice. If you're confused by other elements of Europa Universalis 5, I have a load of different tutorials on the different aspects that are going to get you up to speed. They're very beginner friendly because, well, I know I was confused when I first started playing this game. There'll be a playlist with everything that you need to know. And please put any questions in the comments. I'll be happy to answer them. So if you did find it helpful, chaps, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and I'll see you all next time. Goodbye.